Hello, students, and welcome to week 2 of British Literature, English 2322. My name is Professor Hewlett, and I'm going to walk you through our lecture for this week and some of the information that you'll need to know to be successful in completing your assignments for this week. This is where I will post this video today and in the future. You'll be able to see these videos by looking in the class slideshow, which also will have all of the lecture content. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we cover in this course. English 2322 is a British literature course, and what this means is that it's a combination of a history course as well as a literature course, because in order to learn about the history of the English language, the history of English literature, we're going to have to talk a little bit about the history of these countries and the people who lived there during these time periods in the past. So we're going to do a lot of talking about history as well as talking about literature and reading literature. The literature that we study, literature is fiction, and it's fiction that's coming from the land that today is known as England. It's England and the surrounding islands, which I will show you in a moment. The countries on those islands is what we know them as today. There were lots of changes in the people who were living on those islands, the way they spoke, and the stories that they told in the history that we're going to cover in this class. Because in this class, we're going to be looking at some of the earliest written forms of English language that are known to scholars today. In this course, we're going to focus on literature that was created from approximately 400 AD to 1700 AD. So we're going from Anglo-Saxons to Shakespeare, basically, in this course. This week, we're going to start with that earliest group of English people, or early English people, called the Anglo-Saxons. We're also going to be learning about the dating system, this system that is used to determine 400 AD to 1700 AD. We'll talk about what that dating system is and how it works, and about the first group of English descendants, the Anglo-Saxons. And the Anglo-Saxons are the people who created the earliest British literature that is currently known to modern scholars. We're going to look at some of their poetry this week. And next week, we're going to be looking at an epic poem called Beowulf, called an epic because it is so big, but also because of the type of context that it covers. It's a poem. It's written in poetry format, but it's actually a full-length story, one of the earliest pieces of fantasy fiction that we are aware of in existence today. And we'll be talking about that next week. So we'll be looking this week at the Anglo-Saxons. You can see the date here, about 449 to 1066 AD. And here's our agenda. So we're going to look at how does the dating system work and what does it mean? Who were the Anglo-Saxon people? What was the Anglo-Saxon language? And what is special about Anglo-Saxon literature? In other words, why are we looking at this? Why are we studying this literature? And we will actually be looking at 3 different pieces of Anglo-Saxon literature this week. You're going to read 3 different poems, Anglo-Saxon poems: The Seafarer, The Wanderer, and The Wife's Lament. And those readings are already in Google Classroom. And some of you might have gotten started on those last week because they've been posted since week 1. So you might have already started perusing through those, but we will be reading them this week. So let's talk a little bit about understanding the system of dating so that we understand how to talk about these dates that we're seeing come up everywhere as we are understanding when these pieces were written and when these people lived. So understanding the system of dating in early British literature. In AD 525, the monk Dionysius Exiguus, we see a picture of him right here, he designed the Anno Domini era, or the Anno Domini calendar. This is where that term AD comes from that you see right here. It's a method for cataloging years, which is still widely used in English-speaking countries today. This calendar began with the birth of Jesus Christ. So Dionysius was a monk. He was a Christian monk. He studied Christianity, wrote about Christianity, was very passionate about Christianity. So it makes sense that he would create a calendar that was based around Christianity, and this focal point of Christianity being Jesus Christ, the birth of Jesus Christ. So basically, year 0 AD is the year that Jesus was born. All of the years prior to Jesus' birth were called BC, which is before Christ, and all of the years that came after he was born are AD, which is Anno Domini, basically, which means after the Common Era. So people often think that AD means after death. That is not correct. If that was the case, then there would be no way to catalog the 33 years that Jesus was actually alive. So year zero, 0 AD, begins the year that Jesus was born. Everything before Christ, BC, is before he was born. So just to help you get those cleared up in your heads. Christ died at 33 AD, according to the Anno Domini era calendar. This calendar was mostly used at the time when Dionysius created this calendar. The purpose of the calendar was to help them map when religious ceremonies and holidays would take place, especially Easter, because Easter, which was based in a pagan holiday, the timing of Easter has to do with lunar cycles, the way that where the moon is during times of the year, which means that it wasn't in a specific date each year. It's always on a Sunday, but the date that it falls on varies. And this calendar was to help them determine when that holiday would fall, so they could plan it for the church calendar. So Dionysius was not setting out to create a calendar that would necessarily be used for the rest of time in order to catalog all kinds of different events. He was really trying to create a calendar that would be used by monks to catalog events in the church. That was it. But in 731 AD, a little over 200 years later, the Anno Domini era became the most widespread method of dating, keeping track of dates, that was being used in Europe, because another monk named Bede, who we will talk about more later, adopted this system as he started to catalog a lot of historical papers and historical events and translations and keep track of the dates when they were written and the time period when he was writing them down. So he chose to use this calendar, which at that time had been being used in the Christian churches for 200 years. He used that calendar, and because he was very widespread in his writing and publication, that cataloging method and the way of keeping track of the years became very popular. At this time, monks were the ones who did the majority of the writing, as you'll see in this final bullet point here. The vast majority of the writing that was being done at the time was done by monks. These were some of the only people who were educated enough to read and write. Most common or regular folks like you and me were not able to read and write during this time period. So if anything was being written down, it was being written down by these educated clergymen or monks. The monks obviously were Christian, and they had a very Christian bias. Their bias affected their choices in what they wrote, how they interpreted popular stories, and their system for timekeeping, because the religion was their priority in their lives. That was the focal point of what they did. So this means that monks often rewrote classic oral stories as Christian tales, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about Beowulf next week, incorporating mentions of God or Jesus that had never actually been in the stories. So Christianity was a very new religion at this time. Very, very new. Judaism existed. The Jewish religion existed. That's actually the religion that Jesus himself belonged to. Christianity was not created until it started to be created about 50 to 100 AD, and it wasn't becoming more widespread until about 300 to 400 AD. So it was a new idea, thinking about Christianity as its own religion, looking at Jesus Christ as the center of a religion. That was a really new idea, and it was just starting to gain ground and become more popular. So where there was Judaism, which did rely on the Old Testament and has a lot of similarities to modern Christianity, and modern Christianity was very much built off of Judaism. Most of the people during this time were what was called by the Christian people called pagans. So this would be, you've probably studied like ancient Roman or ancient Greek mythology, the idea of these polytheistic religions, and we will talk about this more in the future weeks. But most of the religions at this time were not Christian, and they were not monotheistic. Most people who did practice any kind of religion or spiritual belief, it was more connected to the earth. It was this idea of polytheistic religion, so lots of different gods who were in charge of the different roles in society or in the world. It's not, instead of just having one god, like Christianity did. So this idea of a polytheistic religion had been much more common. And as the Christians became more popular throughout Europe, and because they tended to be the more educated, like the monks, they really started infiltrating the ancient stories and conversations that had existed for a long time. They started putting them down in writing and adding in their own Christian influence. And that changed the way that people saw their stories, and it changed the popularity of Christianity as it became more widespread. And we will talk about that more as we move forward. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the dating system, what that is, what is BC, what is AD, what is BCE and CE. You will see these terms come up frequently as we are studying the history of England and the English language in Britain. So it is important to know the difference between BC, AD, BCE, and CE. As we talked about on the last slide, BC refers to before Christ, AD refers to Anno Domini, BCE refers to before the Common Era, which is a more modern term for BC, and CE refers to the Common Era. Let's watch this little video real quick to give you a quick synopsis of what we're talking about here, and then we'll come back together.
All right, here we go. BC and AD in 5 minutes or less. I've had a lot of questions about this, so here we go. Keeping track of time dates back to the ancient Mesopotamians. There were many civilizations that had their own system of keeping track of years, but our modern system of numbering years was not developed until AD 525 by a man named Dionysius Exiguus. Sorry for the bad pronunciation. Dionysius invented the system that has school children across the globe confused about what AD and BC stand for. So what do these letters mean? BC stands for before Christ. The term BC denotes before the start of the era. For example, when you read 2500 BC out loud, it sounds like this: 2,500 years before the birth of Christ. Naturally, it counts down to the birth of Christ. AD is an abbreviation for a Latin term, Anno Domini, which translates to in the year of the Lord. The term AD denotes years after the beginning of this era. When writing the dates, AD comes before the numbers. This labeling system has been in heavy use for close to 1,500 years. So there's a common misconception out there, and that it's that AD stands for after death, as in after the death of Jesus. That doesn't even make any sense. This would mean that the 33 years commonly associated with the life of Jesus would not be included in either of the BC or AD timescales. What's even more confusing to school children in the world is how these dates work. Think of time as a number line. All the years that came before Christ are counting down to his birth, or if you're a mathlete, those are negative numbers. All the years after the birth of Jesus go up. These are positive numbers. Now I know what you're thinking. What if you don't believe in JC? Well, this dating system has been the unofficial global standard for many years. The system gained popularity when Charlemagne, or his friends called him Charles the Great, began using this system to date acts of government. Although there's a new way to refer to these years, the concept behind naming the years remains rooted in religion. So what do we use now? Well, since the later part of the 20th century, the use of BCE and CE have been popularized. Authors that wanted a more secular approach to the writing began referring to the years formerly known as before Christ to BCE, which stands for before the Common Era. The years formerly known as ED will now be referred to as CE, which stands for the Common Era. More and more books and scholars are using these terms in their writings. Well, are you wrong if you use the old method? No. Since the years in both methods of labeling are equivalent, you will not be punished for using either method. Just keep in mind you may get some looks of disgust from people who have no idea what you're talking about. It happens to me a lot. So ever since the Mesopotamians, people have been keeping track of time. It wasn't until 800s that people started using the AD BC method. Because the world was different in the 800s, our methods of labeling years have changed. For now, you're correct if you use either method of dating years. Well, that's our 5 minutes or less. Here are some sources. And some photo credits.
Okay, so hopefully that makes the BC, AD, BCE, and CE eras a little bit more clear for you. I'll go ahead and move forward from here. So let's talk a little bit about this Anglo-Saxon period that we're going to be working on this week and next while we're working on Beowulf. So here you can see this is a map of the islands that make up the United Kingdom today. So you can see there's this big island here where England is. And there's also a section called Wales, and to the north, the country called Scotland. And then there's another island over to the west here where Ireland and Northern Ireland are. And then there's some like little islands off the coasts. So we understand the boundaries for what these countries are today, but there was a lot of changing over between different groups of people during the time period that we're going to be talking about in this class. So the period that's known as the Anglo-Saxon period is from roughly 450 to 1066 AD. The map that we're looking at here is a modern map of the islands that are now Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. But the Anglo-Saxon period denotes the period in Britain between these time periods 450 to 1066 AD before the formal countries were established. So there were islands here, but they didn't necessarily belong to any specific kingdom or any specific country yet. The early Anglo-Saxon period includes the creation of the English nation. And actually, one group of the Anglo-Saxons called the Angles is actually where the name England comes from. It was Angleland, which later became England. So the Anglo-Saxons, Anglos and Saxons were actually two different groups of seafaring folk. And we're going to learn a little bit about the seafaring folk when we're reading the poetry of the Anglo-Saxons. These obviously had to be people who were quite good at navigating the oceans because there was no way to walk from the mainland of Europe, or what we know of as Europe today, over to these islands. You'd have to be able to be pretty good with a ship. So the people who were living on these islands during this early time period, in the Anglo-Saxon time period, were excellent seafarers for the most part. And there were some native people who lived on the lands as well who were called Britons, who were actually descendants of the Celtic people. So there were lots of different groups of people who were coming and going off of these islands, and this was a highly coveted area. Lots of people wanted to get their hands on this area of land and wanted to be able to own it for their own purposes. So the early Anglo-Saxon period includes the creation of the English nation, which we see here, with many of the aspects that survive today. During this period is also when Christianity was established, and Christianity became really heavily embedded in the history of the English people and the history of the English language. Okay, so during the early Anglo-Saxon period is when Christianity came into the region, and this is also when literature started to be established. The Anglo-Saxon people, for the most part, could not read and write. It was, like I mentioned before, the monks and the people who were quite wealthy who would have been literate. And most of the time, if they were literate, they were able to read and write in Latin. So the language that the Anglo-Saxons spoke was actually Old English. And it wasn't started, people didn't start writing down the Old English language until about 700 AD. So we're talking about like 250 years later. after the beginning of the early Anglo-Saxon period. This is medieval times. So there were obviously stories happening, but they were always going to be oral tradition stories. The bards, the word bard actually comes from an old Celtic word. So these people who would travel around and tell stories and share stories, they were all shared in the oral tradition because the average person couldn't read and write and there weren't any books. So they were sharing literature, they were sharing fiction, but it wasn't written down until somebody kind of figured out how to write Old English symbols. And some of those were the Old English symbols, some of them incorporated some of the Roman alphabet that we know today. So the term Anglo-Saxon is popularly used for the language that was spoken at the time, which was also known as Old English. And it's also the term that was used for the people who lived in these regions during this early medieval time period. So Anglo-Saxon can refer to the language and it can refer to the people. The Anglo-Saxon people in England and southeastern Scotland were from the mid 5th century until the mid 12th century, as we've mentioned. And in scholarly use, we also refer to the Anglo-Saxon language. We typically refer to that as Old English, not Anglo-Saxon English, but you can hear it either way. So just so you're aware, if you should see that term pop up, it can refer to the language or the people. All right, so there is a tab here for how did England become the England that we know today. I'm not going to play this in my lecture today, but I'd like you to come and watch the first half of this video. At least the first 5 minutes covers the time period that we're talking about during these next couple of weeks. But like the first 10 minutes of the movie or so, maybe like 12 minutes of this video covers the time period that we will cover in this class. So from about 400 AD up until the 1700s. So if you kind of want to see a history in video format of the history of England, this is a really good video to watch. So come back and watch this. You can link to it from the slideshow here. Okay, so who were the Anglo-Saxon people? This video is a brief discussion of who the Anglo-Saxon people were, and I'm going to share that with you here. And then we'll come back together.
This video is brought to you by Captivating History. For people living centuries ago, it would have been impossible to imagine that a small island off the coast of continental Europe would one day be epicenter of world power and prestige. A kingdom that would have control over about 1/4 of the planet's land and its population. Although the United Kingdom no longer enjoys its once lofty stature, it is still a key player in world politics. Before reaching its zenith, however, England and its neighbors were a strategically placed jumble of islands that hosted more than its share of turf wars. The Romans, Vikings, Britons, and Celts all vied for control. To you by Captivating History. For people living centuries ago, it would have been impossible to imagine that a small island off the coast of continental Europe would one day be epicenter of world power and prestige. A kingdom that would have control over about 1/4 of the planet's land and its population. Although the United Kingdom no longer enjoys its once lofty stature, it is still a key player in world politics. Before reaching its zenith, however, England and its neighbors were a strategically placed jumble of islands that hosted more than its share of turf wars. The Romans, Vikings, Britons, and Celts all vied for control of England, as did a loose group of tribes from Central Europe who became collectively known as the Anglo-Saxons. Beginning about 43 CE, the Romans lay claim to most of the British Isles, except for Scotland. But by the late 3rd century and into the early 4th century, the Roman Empire was in decline. Therefore, resources were pulled from outlying posts, such as Britain. Although it is much less tidy than history books make it seem, the end of the Roman rule over Britain occurred in the year 410, the year that the Visigoths sacked Rome. The Romans pulled out of Britain, leaving the people living there, a blend of native Britons, Romans, and Celts, vulnerable to raiding barbarians. Although they were no longer part of this video is brought to you by Captivating History. For people living centuries ago, it would have been impossible to imagine that a small island off the coast of continental Europe would one day be epicenter of world power and prestige. A kingdom that would have control over about 1/4 of the planet's land and its population. Although the United Kingdom no longer enjoys its once lofty stature, it is still a key player in world politics. Before reaching its zenith, however, England and its neighbors were a strategically placed jumble of islands that hosted more than its share of turf wars. The Romans, Vikings, Britons, and Celts all vied for control of England, as did a loose group of tribes from Central Europe who became collectively known as the Anglo-Saxons. Beginning about 43 CE, the Romans lay claim to most of the British Isles, except for Scotland. But by the late 3rd century and into the early 4th century, the Roman Empire was in decline. Therefore, resources were pulled from outlying posts, such as Britain. Although it is much less tidy than history books make it seem, the end of the Roman rule over Britain occurred in the year 410, the year that the Visigoths sacked Rome. The Romans pulled out of Britain, leaving the people living there, a blend of native Britons, Romans, and Celts, vulnerable to raiding barbarians. Although they were no longer part of the Roman Empire, the people of Britain still closely identified with Rome. Religion, laws, written language, and government all reflected its Roman background. With the departure of Roman rule, Germanic marauders met with little resistance during their raids on Britain. At the time, these marauders were not called Anglo-Saxons, but were most likely members of the Anglos, the Saxons, the Jutes, and other Germanic groups. After decades of raiding British villages, then sailing back to their homes on the European continent, the Anglo-Saxons put down permanent roots on the British Isles. The transition from Roman control to Anglo-Saxon rule was not a smooth one, but in time, the Anglo-Saxons merged with the native Britons. They moved into their villages, took over their farmland, and intermarried with the people already living there. They commanded military forces and, over time, rose to power as leaders of villages, towns, and regions. Historians often use the term Dark Ages to describe the time after the Roman rule of Britain, the time when the Anglo-Saxons ruled the land. This implies that the era was a time of intellectual stagnation and brutality, but this was not the case. The Anglo-Saxons injected a set of new religious beliefs, military tactics, literature, and a unified attitude into the Roman lifestyle of the island. The resulting blend of ideas took Britain on a different path, one that eventually led to something akin to world domination. The Anglo-Saxons had no written language, so historians don't have a complete picture of their belief system after they converted to Christianity. Bits and pieces of archaeological evidence tell a story, though. For example, the graves of high-ranking people, including kings, queens, high priests, and military heroes, show us that people in higher social statuses were revered, even in death. Another clue could be found in the names of places, as the Anglo-Saxons were fond of naming their settlements to honor certain deities. Some villages even bear names that include the words like Draka and Thris, which mean dragon and giant, hinting that the Anglo-Saxons' belief system may have included fanciful beasts. Despite the lack of written records, we can assume that the Anglo-Saxons' pantheon of gods was similar to that of other Germanic tribes, and oral stories bear this out. Even written stories, much later, mention the chief deity of the Anglo-Saxons as Woden, a name that sounds strikingly similar to the Scandinavian Odin. Various Anglo-Saxon gods remain part of our everyday vocabulary in the names of the days of the week. Tuesday, for example, comes from Tuesday, and Thursday comes from Thorsday. The Anglo-Saxons must have felt so strongly about keeping their deities in the names of the days, because the names have lasted for centuries and have become ingrained in the English language. The Anglo-Saxons seem to have had a pagan belief system closely tied to nature. Specific trees or certain groves within forests were thought to have spiritual energy. Interestingly, many of these places were used as sites for churches and Christian structures. The Anglo-Saxons organized themselves into social classes similar to other Germanic tribes. At the head of the tribe is the chieftain, a title that later became king. The position of chieftain or king passed through male bloodlines, with the ruler's eldest son as the heir. The word king comes to us from the ancient word kin, which literally means family lineage. The Anglo-Saxons strongly believed that the male bloodline had to be kept pure because it was the family's link back to Woden. Once the Anglo-Saxons of Britain converted to Christianity, the custom of heredity remained important, though sometimes the crown passed to indirect heirs and even female leaders. Before their conquest of Britain, the Anglo-Saxons had no written language. They only developed one after their conversion to Christianity. But this doesn't mean that the Anglo-Saxons were not creative storytellers. Once they adopted a written language, they recorded many of their legendary tales, most notably Beowulf. This epic poem was first put to paper in the 19th century by an unknown scribe. Over time, Christian elements were added to the story. Beyond the tribal chieftains, the Anglo-Saxon villagers were structured with social hierarchies similar to other medieval settlements. There were farmers, merchants, builders, and people who made weapons, cloth, leather goods, and other necessary items. This working class answered to the ruling class, but were free to live their lives as they wished. The slave class enjoyed far fewer freedoms. The most prominent occupation was farming. The production of food also included hunting and fishing. Evidence tells us that the men of the tribe not only grew and hunted the food, but they also prepared and cooked it. Women baked bread, brewed beer, and made cheese, but it was the task of the male members of the community to cook the meat they procured. Women in Anglo-Saxon culture, no matter their social standing, served drinks to the men. The Anglo-Saxons may have earned a reputation for violence and brutality, but they also loved to have a rowdy good time. Parties with drinking, feasting, singing, dancing, and beautiful women were commonplace. As shown in caricatures of the Anglo-Saxons, they did decorate with deer antlers and drink from polished horns. Both men and women worked as entertainers, dancing, singing, or acting out oral stories for enthralled crowds at festivals and gatherings. The Anglo-Saxons didn't make wine, but they did make a weak beer. Their beverage of choice, however, was mead, a drink made with fermented honey with a higher alcohol content. When they weren't celebrating with mead and venison, the Anglo-Saxons were often engaged in battles against the Britons and the Romans, who ruled over them. When the Romans pulled out of Britain, the Anglo-Saxons exerted their formidable power over the Britons living in coastal communities. The warfare was more like raids. Between attacks, the Britons carried on with their own lifestyles, and their way of life was not greatly changed by the Anglo-Saxons for decades. When the Anglo-Saxons eventually settled in parts of Britain, they fought off Viking raiders in the same manner that the Britons fought them. The chieftains of several of the Anglo-Saxon settlements on the British Isles banded together against the invading Vikings. Leading them was an Anglo-Saxon king who became known as Alfred the Great. Under his leadership, the Anglo-Saxons defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Edington in 878. After that, the Vikings retreated to the northeastern region of the island and left the remaining territory to the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons developed some battlefield innovations that changed warfare for the Britons, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, and later the Normans. First, they brought together numerous small village armies into one large, well-organized, and well-commanded fighting unit. They employed archers, javelin throwers, and slingshotters, besides swords and spears. Soldiers used large shields to form an impenetrable wall. Anglo-Saxons even used horses in battle. The Anglo-Saxons held control over Britain until 1066, one of the most momentous years in world history. The Anglo-Saxon king, Edward the Confessor, died, and the crown passed to his successor, Harold Godwinson. His reign, however, lasted only about 9 months. Shortly after, William the Conqueror of Normandy launched the Norman invasion and attacked Britain. Following the Battle of Hastings in October of 1066, the Normans took control of Britain away from the Anglo-Saxons, although the majority of the people living on the islands remained Anglo-Saxons. Even though historians refer to the Anglo-Saxon era in Britain as the Dark Ages, the Anglo-Saxons made their mark on the history of England, and in fact all of Europe. Once they converted to Christianity, they helped to initiate the conversion of their pagan allies, using their various alliances to negotiate foreign relations and to establish a booming trade. Perhaps their biggest contribution was their success in merging the different kingdoms of Britain into one unified force. For the first time, the people living on the British Isles viewed themselves as something bigger than their individual kingdom. They viewed themselves as English. To discover more about the history of the Anglo-Saxon people, then check out our book, The Anglo-Saxons, a captivating guide to the people who inhabited Great Britain from the early Middle Ages to the Norman conquest of England. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook.
Okay, so now that we've learned a little bit about the history of who the Anglo Saxon people were and kind of like what was going on in their culture and society at the time, now we need to talk a little bit about the readings that we're going to be doing this week. We're going to be reading our first medieval British literature this week. We're going to be reading some pieces, three different Anglo Saxon poems that were actually written down by hand. So I don't know if we should say the word published. You can see a picture of the Exeter book up here in the upper left-hand corner. The Exeter book is one of the four oldest pieces of Old English literature that were actually written down as far as scholars know. So one of the four oldest known books written in Old English, so the Old Anglo-Saxon stories. Now it's very likely that these stories were hundreds of years older than the Exeter book. Remember, I told you that the people who were sharing these stories couldn't read or write. So a lot of these stories were carried down generation to generation through bards and other people who memorized the stories and shared them. So we want to learn a little bit about the Exeter book. You're going to read a little bit about the Exeter book in the textbook readings for this week in the Before You Read section in Google Classroom. But I wanted to show you a couple of quick little videos about the Exeter book. Now, the Exeter book still exists. It is saved and they're trying to keep it in as pristine condition as possible. It got pretty destroyed over all of these hundreds of years that it has existed, but for the most part, it still exists, and people can actually go and see it in the Exeter Cathedral Library. So I'm going to share a couple of videos with you that give a little background or history about the Exeter book, and you can start to think about the context within the time period and the people who created these poems that we're going to be reading this week. So let me share these videos with you, and then we'll come back together to end the lesson for this week.
The Seafarer poem is part of an anthology of Anglo-Saxon poetry in a book called the Exeter Book, and it's kept here at Exeter Cathedral Library. Do we know exactly how old the Seafarer is?
We don't know exactly how old it is. We know from experts that the manuscript as a whole was written down sometime in the second half of the 10th century, say between 960 and 980.
Okay.
So it's just over 1,000 years old.
In terms of the author of the Seafarer itself, do we have any clues to who that might have been?
No, we have no idea. In fact, there's only one named author throughout the entire book, and the Seafarer is not associated with him, so we don't know, which is not unusual.
Would it have been a performance piece?
Well, certainly parts of the book seem to stem from the oral tradition, as you say, so that they would have been chanted, declaimed to an audience.
This is the truth. The ways I toiled, distraught, for days on end.
The scribe would have been a monk at this stage, a professional writer, if you like. The parchment itself, which is animal skin essentially, would have been prepared for the scribe before he even started to write. It is, I think anyone would agree, a beautiful script, unfamiliar to most of us, but nevertheless a very handsome looking artifact.
Well, it's really something that's exquisitely beautiful. I mean, as I said to you earlier off camera, I'm sort of used to looking at musical manuscripts which are maybe 200 or perhaps 300 years old, but to view something which is in excess of 1,000 years old is really quite overwhelming.
Okay, so we got a little bit of history about the Exeter book, and you can return to these slides to rewatch any of these videos that you wish, or these slides will be posted in Google Classroom for you. There's also a video here that I shared with you earlier about where the Exeter book can be found today, just a quick little video to see what it looks like. So we're going to end the lecture today by talking about some of the vocab that you're going to need as you're reading the poetry this week. So elements of Anglo-Saxon literature. And as always, just like with all of these lectures and any of the information shared in the lectures, but definitely with vocab words, you want to make sure you're adding this information to your notes. So you should have been taking notes the whole time you've been following along with this lecture, as I talked about in the beginning. So please make sure that you're adding these words to your notes. So we have some new vocab words for this week. Some of them might be familiar, some of them might not. Either way, just want to make sure you have them so you can refer to them later, because if I give you vocab, you can rest assured it's going to come up again. So I want to make sure you feel comfortable with the definitions, where you can find them, and beginning to use this terminology in the discussions that we have in class as we talk about Anglo-Saxon literature. So our new vocab words are hubris. This will continue to be very important as we read Beowulf next week as well. And you can see the definition for hubris on the next slide in this slideshow, if you're not familiar with that term. We're also going to be looking for, in Anglo-Saxon literature, allusions to paganism and allusions to Christianity. Now, allusion is another word for a reference. So we're going to be looking for references to pagans or non-Christians. We'll talk about that a little bit more next week, where the term pagan comes from, and how the term pagan was used as a derogatory term by early Christians as a method of demonstrating the difference between Christianity and anyone who was not Christian. It was kind of a deliberate method of trying to make non-Christians look bad in order to promote Christianity and make Christianity seem more positive or appealing. So you'll be looking for any elements or references to paganism and any allusions to Christianity, such as references to the religion itself, to God, Jesus, or other Christian symbols or religious characters that you might be familiar with from Christianity. Remember that any references to paganism or Christianity that we see pop up in Anglo-Saxon literature are very, very likely to have been written in later by the monks who wrote these stories down. Remember that the Anglo-Saxon Saxons were typically pagan people. They did not start adopting Christianity until much later. So these ancient stories that were shared by the bards and shared between these uneducated people who had not been exposed to Christianity yet would not have included elements of Christianity nor reference to a word pagan, even though these people had beliefs which were later labeled as pagan beliefs. Pagan was just an ugly word for not Christian, which was invented by the Christians. So early Anglo-Saxons definitely would not have referred to themselves as pagan. If they were talking about their faith, or their beliefs, or their spirituality, they were very likely to be talking about references to nature. And you will notice in a lot of these poems that we're reading this week, references to the ocean, references to the weather. Those are the types of connections that the early Anglo-Saxon people would have made in their poetry. They were observing the world around them and talking about their experiences and their emotions, but their connections to any sort of basic religious or faith of any kind, that isn't something that would have been a common part of Anglo-Saxon storytelling. That was added in by the monks who were trying to make sense of the stories that they had heard, and what made sense to them was to explain it through the stories that they knew of Jesus or Christianity, because that's the way that they viewed the world. So unfortunately, when a lot of these stories were written down, the bias of the people who were writing them infiltrated into the stories, making the stories seem more Christian than they actually ever would have been, because the original storytellers were not Christians and did not know anything about Christianity. So just to keep that in mind as you are reading through the poems this week, and as we move into Beowulf next week, looking for those allusions to Christianity or allusions to paganism will be important for us to remember, so we can distinguish the difference between the Anglo-Saxon people and the monks who were writing their stories down, because those are different people, hundreds of years apart from each other oftentimes. The four remaining vocab words down here, elegy, caesura, alliteration, and assonance, you can find these vocab words in the Anglo-Saxon reading that's called Before You Read in Google Classroom. And I will show you where that is before I let you go today. So let me show you. The final slide for this week is the hubris slide, where you can get the definition to add to your notes of the definition of hubris, which is one of the vocab words that I just showed you there on our screen. And then I just want to show you in Google Classroom. If you go into Google Classroom, you'll see now at the top that we have the early Anglo-Saxon verse is week 2. And once I get this video uploaded, the video and the slideshow that I just shared with you will also be here. But I want to show you the readings here. The early Anglo-Saxon poetry is attached here in Google Classroom, and it tells you to be sure that you read the Before Reading Anglo-Saxon Poems pages first. So you can see that down here, Before Reading Anglo-Saxon Poems. If I open this up, these are a couple of pages from the textbook that have the vocabulary words that you need and a little bit of background information about the 3 poems that we're going to read: The Seafarer, The Wanderer, and The Wife's Lament. So please make sure that you have read through these 2 pages of background information, gotten those vocab words. Here, as I told you about before, there's a little bit more background information about the Exeter book, which we learned a little bit about in my lecture today. You can get a little bit more information here in the reading. So just those 2 pages of background information to help get you set up. And then the 3 poems are here: The Seafarer, which we learned about a little bit in the video where we saw the gentleman looking at the Exeter book. They talked about the Seafarer, and there was a little clip of a reading from the Seafarer. The Wanderer, and The Wife's Lament. And I'm actually going to share a video in here as well that gives some more information about the Wanderer and the connection between the Wanderer and J.R.R. Tolkien. You might be familiar with the author J.R.R. Tolkien. He wrote the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. You might have seen those films or read those books. J.R.R. Tolkien was also a professor of medieval literature, and he studied The Wanderer and also Beowulf, which we will be studying over the next couple of weeks. And he used them as motivation to help him create the world of Middle-earth. And a lot of the characters and fantastic monsters and things like that we see in J.R.R. Tolkien's fantasy writing, a lot of it comes from these early Anglo-Saxon writings. So if you're familiar with J.R.R. Tolkien or the stories of the Lord of the Rings, you might recognize some of the references in some of these Anglo-Saxon poems this week or in Beowulf next week. So keep an eye out for that. And if you notice anything, jot it down. And then your assignment for this week is the Anglo-Saxon worksheet. If you open this up, it will give you a copy of a Google Doc that you're just going to type your answers right into that Google Doc. And we'll have a discussion board where we're talking about some of our reactions to the poems that we read this week. So that's what we'll be working on this week. So fewer assignments for you to actually turn in this week than what we had last week, but there is more reading for you to get done this week. So please make sure that you're reading these 4 attachments here. None of them are that long. It's not a lot of reading for you. I think the Wife's Lament and the Seafarer are only a couple pages long each. The Wanderer is a little bit longer. So I'm going to attach a video that helps walk you through an interpretation of the Wanderer to help you understand it. But I want us to start thinking about some of the common themes that we're seeing pop up and how we can make connections between what we now know about the Anglo-Saxon people and what we are seeing in their writings. Or in this case, they weren't written down yet, but the stories or poems that they were sharing during this time period. So medieval times, around 400 to 500 AD, before any of these stories were being written down, these poems were being shared between people who couldn't read and write, sharing the experiences of their lives, sharing their experiences with exile. I want you to look at some of the common themes between these poems and really start to think about what we might be able to figure out as we make connections between the people who wrote these pieces and today, you as an English speaker today, and what sort of connections you can draw from this early Anglo-Saxon poetry. So that is what we are working on this week, kiddos, and that is all that I have for you. If you have any questions for me, please do not hesitate to reach out via email. I will post in Google Classroom for you when I post this video. I will also be posting this slideshow that I just went through in the video, so you can follow through. You can review these slides. You can copy and paste from them directly into your own notes, and you can review any of those videos that you might want to, or any of the videos that I did not actually play all the way through in this lecture. You have access to go back through them. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope you have a wonderful week. And as always, please let me know if you have any questions. Have a great week, kiddos. I will see you next week.